My next guest is Glenn Greenwald, a prolific writer at Salon. His fourth book is out now. It's called With Liberty and Justice for Some, How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality and Protect the Powerful. Glenn Greenwald, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Now, for months, I would say, Americans have been subjected to this continuous, coordinated, repetitive messaging from Israeli officials amplified through the U.S. media. This is what you wrote recently this week. And I want to ask you, is history repeating itself? Are we seeing the same kind of run-up to war with Iran as we saw in 2003 during the lead-up to our attack on Iraq?
There are obvious similarities. The claims basically are the same. Of course, the principal claim in the lead-up to the war in Iraq was that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, specifically nuclear weapons, was probably the claim that made the most number of people be willing to support it. And that is the same claim being made about Iran, that they too are developing nuclear weapons, even though American intelligence agencies and virtually everybody else, including in Israel, says that there's no evidence that Iran has actually decided to build a nuclear weapon. It's their nuclear weapons, it's their nuclear program that is causing the concern. But I think the core similarity is that we are talking about attacking a nation that hasn't attacked any other nation, that isn't threatening to attack any other nation. And so it's not a preemptive war, it's actually a preventative war. Both the Iraq war was and the attack on Iran would be. I think the big difference, though, is that the run-up to the attack on Iraq was really driven by the U.S. government. The Bush administration conceived of this war, decided they wanted to do it, and then pushed for it. Whereas I think the Obama administration is clearly pretty reluctant about involving itself in a war, and it's instead being led by Israel and various neoconservative factions in the U.S. trying to push the U.S. government into this war. So that's a pretty big difference, is that the U.S. government's not in the lead in disseminating this, the beating of the war drum.
Now, just to establish a basic reality baseline, Iran is a member of is a signatory to the NPT, and the IAEA has suspended their ability, their rights to process uranium, but only pending certain inquiries that they have. So there are unsettled issues. Can you unpack the status today?
Sure. I mean, it is true that Iran is signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and one of the core provisions of that treaty that induced so many non-nuclear power states to sign on was that they have the absolute right to develop nuclear programs for energy purposes, for civilian purposes. And part of the obligation of the treaty members is that they subject themselves to inspections by the IAEA to make sure that whatever nuclear research they have is not being geared toward weapons development. Now, that is the most important fact about what's happening in Iran, is that Iran has completely opened up all of its nuclear facilities to the IAEA. There are inspectors on the ground in each one of their nuclear facilities, and it's impossible for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon without it being immediately known to the inspection regime that's on the ground. The IAEA is doing a careful, thorough job in making sure that there are certain processes that aren't being invoked in terms of uranium enrichment and plutonium that would be a signal that Iran is going in the direction of weaponizing their nuclear power. And they do have some questions, but the IAEA has never concluded that there's evidence that says that Iran is building a nuclear weapon. And so it is true that the IAEA has expressed concerns. That's their job, to express concerns, but there's no definitive conclusion.
And I want to just talk about also the likelihood, the likely outcome of an attack on Iran, whether it was from Israeli Air Force or with the assistance of the United States. I feel like in our discourse, it's assumed that given our technological superiority and Israel's technological superiority, they could simply wipe them out wipe out their nuclear capacity like they did in Iraq in 1981. And I just want to quote a couple of people. The former Mossad director, Ephraim Halevi, he was the director from 2002 to 2011. He said, quote, "An attack on Iran could affect not only Israel but the entire region for 100 years." And he said that while Iran should certainly be prevented from becoming a nuclear power. Its capabilities are still, quote, far from posing an existential threat. Now, his successor, who came on after him to head the Mossad, which is, of course, the Israeli equivalent of the CIA, MahmoudAhmadinejad, he said, quote, a military attack will give the Iranians the best excuse to pursue the nuclear race. And he said that the possibility of an Air Force attack on Iranian nuclear facilities is, quote, the stupidest thing I have ever heard. So isn't there this huge disconnect between our media's portrayal of the likely outcome? Are we being given the risk, the concept of what is at risk here?
One of the things that traditionally happens in American political discourse about war is that war is often depicted as this very clinical, clean, easy mission. And the reason why it's able to be sold that way is because such a small, tiny portion of the population actually has any experience with war, because American wars are fought with only a tiny fraction of the population actually anywhere near the scene of combat. And so I do think that Americans have this image of war as being something where you just send drone planes or even manned aircraft over Iran, drop a few bombs, and their nuclear program is destroyed. And the reality is much different, as those quotes that you just read from those Mossad officials indicate. But I think there's an even broader point, which is that there's an interesting op-ed in the Washington Post today from Colin Kahl, who's a former Pentagon official under the Obama administration, who explained that the Israeli attack in 1981 on a nuclear facility in Iraq, which at the time Iraqi said was only for was only for civilian purposes, but the Israelis said they were concerned that it was going to be used to build a bomb, actually completely backfired, because it turned out that in 1981, when the Israelis attacked Iraq and dropped bombs on that Iraqi facility, Saddam was nowhere near close to building a bomb, but it was that attack that made him realize that the only way he would ever get respect on the world stage is by developing a nuclear weapon. And in 1991, when the Americans were able to overrun Iraq and drive them out of Kuwait, they were able to get access to some of those labs and were shocked to discover just how close Iraq was to actually building a nuclear weapon. And this is really what we're doing, is through this aggression, through these constant threats, we're making the motivation very high for these states to develop nuclear weapons. And the task that the Israelis had in 1981 was extremely difficult, to fly to Iraq and destroy that nuclear facility. And the task of doing it to Iran is infinitely more difficult. There's a far greater distance. It stretches the refueling capacity of the Israeli jets. There are numerous nuclear facilities, not just one, dispersed throughout the country. Some of them are buried far under mountainous regions and embedded into mountains that would require extreme levels of explosive device to get to. And so the outcome, I think, is completely unpredictable, which is what those military planners and Mossad officials are afraid of. And Iran has a much greater retaliatory capability than the Iraqis had. And so what you're talking about is a major, major attack that would probably involve lots of ground activity as well as air activity, and that very well may not even set back the Iranian nuclear program at all, may have the opposite effect of accelerating it.
If you're just tuning in, this is Joshua Holland, and I'm speaking with Glenn Greenwald about Iran on the Alternate Radio Hour. Glenn, I think that it would also unify the country around the Iranian regime, wouldn't it?
I mean, that's probably the worst reason to do it. I mean, the reality is that, a lot of times in American media discussion, we like to depict the Iranian opposition as sort of this pro-Western, liberalized political faction, and to some extent they are, but the reality is that all political factions in Iran are staunchly in favor of continuing with the nuclear program on the grounds that Iran has the absolute right to develop a nuclear energy program. And governments around the world, in fact, agree with Iran about that. And if you look at what happened with the September 11th attack, which was a single one-day attack by non-state actors, the entire country, including huge numbers of people who had previously strongly disliked George Bush and the Republican Party, unified around the government and around its leader, which is George Bush and Dick Cheney and the Republican Party. That's what happens whenever a nation is attacked by an external force. And so nothing could be better for the hardline conservative mullahs and ruling elite in Iran than for it to be attacked by some combination of Israel and the United States. It would completely save them from the rising citizen discontent over the economy and other factors by unifying them behind those conservative leaders, and not just Iran, but unifying the entire world, Arab world, around Iran and against the United States and Israel.
Now, I want to make it very, very clear to our listeners that the intelligence community in both the United States and Israel, the consensus is that Iran is not currently trying to produce nuclear weapons. Most analysts believe that they are trying to reach so-called breakout capacity where they can produce a nuclear weapon. And yet I've seen dozens of news stories in the American media that take it as a given that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons and not just trying to achieve breakout capacity. But I want to talk about a little bit about this idea. You quote a New York Times article by Israeli journalist Ronen Bergman in January. And in his lead, he wrote, quote, "The Iranians are, after all, a nation whose leaders have set themselves a strategic goal of wiping Israel off the map." This seems to be a central part of the propaganda push. It's the idea that whereas deterrence was enough to prevent nuclear Armageddon during the Cold War, when we were facing off with the Soviet Union that had really equal capacity to our own, or somewhat, at least some semblance of parity, with these mad mullahs, that kind of mutually assured destruction is not going to be would not be an effective deterrent because they don't mind being martyrs and hanging out with 71 virgins in the case of a retaliatory attack from Israel. Tell me about this assumption that they're somehow beyond human concern for their own lives and their lives of their citizens.
Yeah, I mean, think about how incredibly deceitful this is in such obvious ways. I mean, for one thing, if the Iranians were this regime that wanted to exterminate Jews and didn't care what the repercussions were, there's a very easy way for them to get a really good start on that, which is to take the 25,000 Iranian Jews that are living quite peacefully and prosperously inside of Iran and simply round them up and kill them. And yet that doesn't happen. There are, I mean, I don't want to depict it as this, incredibly romanticized way, but there's an Iranian Jew in Iran's parliament. They have freedom of religion in that country. They exercise most of the civic rights. So if they were some sort of, second coming of Nazis, none of that would be true. But more to the point, if you were on a posit that a country is essentially suicidal, and let's be very clear, if Iran were to use nuclear weapons against Israel or the United States, its obliteration as a country would basically be guaranteed. Israel has a second strike capability. You could launch nuclear weapons at Israel, and they have all kinds of devices that are guaranteed to destroy whatever country has done that. The United States would certainly be involved in that as well. So you're talking about literally positing the idea, if you don't believe containment is possible with a nuclear-armed Iran, that they are literally suicidal and are willing to risk the complete destruction and annihilation of their country. And if that were true, one would presumably see evidence of that at some point in the last 31 years since the Iranian Revolution installed these mullahs in power, and yet there's none of that. Iran has not, during that time, even invaded another country, unlike Israel and the United States, which has invaded and bombed many. They have been very shrewd in calculating about cultivating alliances around the world with Russia, China, and other countries, Venezuela. And they've been very calculated and very cunning about holding on to power. These are leaders who have demonstrated repeatedly that they care about what the things that typically political leaders care about, which is maximizing their power, ensuring their own continuation. And that's the ultimately rational mentality that the Iranians have displayed.
Now, just continuing on this theme, MahmoudAhmadinejad, he has certainly made some explosive statements. I think he's a right-wing religious fanatic, a fundamentalist. I think that right-wing religious fundamentalists are inherently dangerous, whatever their religion and culture. But it's important, I think, for people to understand that he doesn't really have control over the Iranian military, does he?
No, the person who runs all of Iran, especially its foreign and military policy, is the person who has the title of Supreme Leader, whose title is self-explanatory. Ahmadinejad may be the third or fourth most powerful person in the country, if that. In fact, there were just elections yesterday and today, in which most of his allies were defeated at the polls, including his own sister, who was running for Iran's parliament, and was defeated. He's been weakened by rivals in all kinds of ways. But, I think let's just take a step back and look at the broader context. Oftentimes, as you mentioned, much is made of the comment that we want to see Israel wiped off the map. If you look at some of the United States' closest allies in that region, the ones that we arm and fund and prop up and bolster and protect, those countries, too, have regimes that are run by far right-wing religious fanatics, including Saudi Arabia and other countries as well. And the policy of most of those countries, for example, if you go to the website of the United Arab Emirates, one of the closest American allies for quite some time, what you will see on their immigration page is a statement that no Israelis are permitted into the country, and the word Israelis are in quotes because they don't recognize the right of that country to exist. They believe that the right map of the world is one that excludes Israel. This is true for many of the countries in that region. And so Ahmadinejad, although he tends to be more flamboyant and obnoxious and offensive in his political rhetoric, that's just the kind of politician that he is basically reciting what is standard political doctrine among many of these extremist religious Muslim states, which is that Israel is a legitimate state, and that the goal of these countries, the policy goal, is to remove it from the map, to eliminate it. But that is universes away from suggesting that they would militarily attack Israel in order to eradicate it, and it's even more universes away from the idea that they would be able to do so without destroying themselves. And so, one of the things that a smart, civilized, strong power does is it looks at political rhetoric and decides what it needs to take seriously and what it doesn't. And the idea that simply because Iran doesn't believe Israel's right to exist means that they need to be attacked or they're an existential threat to Israel is absurd, given how common that sentiment is in that part of the world.
And I certainly don't want to defend Ahmadinejad, but Juan Cole, the Middle East scholar, does say that this was a quote from Ayatollah Khomeini, something he said in the 70s, and it was taken out of context. I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. position. You wrote this week that in his interview with Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg, Barack Obama, quote, issued his most absolute and inflexible threat yet to attack Iran, not if Iran attacks or is about to attack another country, but merely if it appears to be developing a nuclear weapon. Now, I wonder, isn't that quite a bit of difference, a significant difference from the Israeli position, which is that the attempt to reach breakout capacity is unto itself unacceptable. Here we have Obama saying that only when they, unless I'm reading this wrong, only when they attempt to make a weapon will the U.S. find that that's a red line that's being crossed.
Right. Well, there have been some mixed signals on this from the Obama administration in terms of what the quote-unquote red line is, which means basically the point beyond which Iran cannot go without prompting a U.S. attack. There have been statements from Hillary Clinton and others in the administration that have used the Israeli formulation that it is quote-unquote unacceptable for Iran to develop a nuclear weapons capability, meaning the ability to develop a nuclear weapon in some short period of time, the breakout capacity that you have talked about. President Obama, however, has been careful to define the red line as being the pursuit of a nuclear weapon, the decision to build a nuclear weapon, and then the action taken towards its construction. Now, that's the reason that Israel and the United States are currently at loggerheads. It's because Israel is arguing that if a certain point in time passes, it will then become impossible for them to attack Iran themselves any longer, because Iran will have the capability to develop a nuclear weapon and will be sufficiently fortified from Israeli military capabilities to prevent an Israeli attack that would prevent that from happening, and they would essentially be dependent upon the United States. And Israel is saying we don't want to be in the position where we're dependent upon the United States to do this for us, and that's why we don't want to wait. And Obama is saying, well, you shouldn't be worried about that because I'm giving you my absolute word, and I'm issuing this threat that if Iran ever starts developing a nuclear weapon, we will attack. And in that interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, he said, I think I've proven that as president, I don't bluff. When I say that I'm going to attack, you can mean it.
Tough talk.
And
so, Glenn, thank you so much. We are actually out of time. I want to thank you for coming on, and I hope to have you on again, and we can discuss these issues at more length. I want to thank everybody for joining us this week. I want to thank Kristen Lee, my producer, Gordon Whiting, our audio engineer. I want to thank Andrew O'Melveny. He's our associate producer and audio editor, and I want to thank Alternet.org and our readers who have supported us over the years, and I also want to thank React Radio, 1480 AM in Washington, D.C. Come back next week. We're going to have another great show.
Check it out, you got me mesmerized with your black hair and your fat ass style. Street poetry is my everyday, but yo, I gotta stop when you drop my weight. If I was working at